back, and we're joined by one of my colleagues at the Center for Security Policy, as you can tell. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, United States Marine Corps Reserves. He is a force reconnaissance combat veteran with considerable and decorated service to our country in that role. He's joining us today in his civilian role, working as the Senior Director at the Center's Infrastructure Security Project. And I'm very proud of our association and delighted to have a chance to talk with him about how we're doing on providing protection for our infrastructure. Tommy, it's good to have you with us. Welcome back.
Frank, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this work. It's a calling, and it's super important right now.
It is super important. And I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about how some of the insights we talked earlier in the program with Dr. Stephen Blank about Ukraine, how some of the takeaways from what has been happening there has really powerfully reinforced the work that you've been doing, including leading our Secure the Grid coalition. Talk a bit about some of those takeaways, Tommy.
Yeah, so Frank, as you mentioned, in terms of lessons learned from Ukraine, I'm sure your viewers have seen so many of the news reports about the risks to the Ukrainian nuclear power plants. There are 4 in operation still. A 5th, Chernobyl, of course, was in the news. Chernobyl, as we both know, is no longer operating. But there was a significant concern in the media about the fact that that nuclear power plant, the off-site grid power, the electricity used to cool the spent nuclear fuel on site at the Chernobyl facility had been cut off, in fact, numerous times. So there was a concern about what could happen with that. In the Ukraine, thankfully, in Chernobyl, that nuclear fuel is so old that there's really little risk that it would boil the water off in those storage pools and cause the types of fires and radioactive releases that we're concerned about. But that's a lesson for us, Frank, because we have across this country 83,000 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel at 75 different sites, much of which is stored in these pools, these above ground pools, which require grid power to operate.
And the rods that are in those pools are hot, unlike the Chernobyl ones, and therefore you could really have a Fukushima style problem. This is something that one of our colleagues, Tom Popick, brought to the attention of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I think it was 11 years ago, Tommy. How is it that that problem hasn't been fixed before now? Is it that it's insoluble, or is there actually something that could be done, and why hasn't it been done?
Yeah, incredibly, Frank, the Foundation for Resilient Societies put in this, it's called a petition for rulemaking. They were petitioning the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, to create rules for the industry to enable that offsite power, or to enable that backup power for the cooling of the nuclear spent fuel to be done in such a way that doesn't require the current system, which is backup emergency diesel generators and diesel fuel, right? The NRC's current standard says that the industry only has to have 7 days worth of fuel for those backup generators. Those generators could go down. They're vulnerable to a number of threats, including electromagnetic pulse or directed energy weapons. So there's a significant risk there that if you lose that offsite power, the grid power, and then you lose the ability to generate power at the facility with, say, for example, a diesel generator, you could have a big problem. As you mentioned, Frank, that water could boil off of those very hot spent fuel rods. So this petition, what it said is to use existing technologies, of which there are many. You've got solar power that can be used. You've got Rankine cycle engines, essentially technology that can take the waste heat and generate electricity that can be used to power the pumps to pump that water. This is a problem that's solvable, Frank. They just need to exert the actual will to do it. There's been more than 100 different petitions to the NRC for various types of rules. They've only accepted 2. Tom Popick and the Foundation's is one of those 2, but it's time after 11 years that they actually take action on it.
Past time, I'd say. Tommy, President Biden has said very directly and explicitly that we should be anticipating a Russian cyber attack against the United States. Um, how prepared are we, just from the point of view of this most critical of critical infrastructures, our electric grid, to contend with that kind of threat? Is it a real one as you see it? And what best we be doing about it?
Yeah, Frank, you're absolutely right. It is the cyber vulnerability is real and present to our grid. And in fact, President Biden said on March 21st that it's coming. That was his words. It's coming. And he was talking about a cyber attack from Russia on our critical infrastructures. The other thing that he said that day was that it's the industry that is responsible for deciding what protections that we have for that industry. And this applies to the grid, Frank. Although we have regulatory agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, it's really the industry that decides the protection standards. And when it comes to the specific threat of Russia and cyber warfare, we've known since really 2014 that there's malware in our grid, the same type of malware used to take down the Ukrainian grid back in 2015. It's present in our grid.
By the Russians.
And we've petitioned. What's that, Frank?
By the Russians.
Exactly, Russian malware in our grid. And we've petitioned the regulators, FERC, to create rules that the industry must detect and remove that malware. And yet they've taken no such action. In fact, it's so bad that back in 2019, in September, the former NSA Chief Information Officer, George Cotter, wrote to FERC and said that the fact that our grid hasn't been taken down via cyber from Russia is completely due to their own restraint and not the industry actually protecting that infrastructure.
Tommy, this is such an important point. We're going to return to it in just a minute after a very short break and talk a little bit further about what we can be doing about protecting our electric grid and more generally protecting our people and country against the sorts of threats that are now, I guess, a subject of restraint on the Russians' part and perhaps the Chinese as well, but we shouldn't be banking on it. We're going to talk more about that with Colonel Tommy Waller right after this.